And this is London. If you're listening in the Washington, D.C. area, you're listening on Crystal Clear FM 105.5. Why don't you tune in if you're in D.C.? And we're on AM right across the United States from Burning City to Burning City. Although it's funny, none of these cities seem now any longer to be burning. You can listen across the entire globe thanks to SputnikNews.com. But if you are one of the more than 500,000 people that every week watch as well as listen, then please listen up. If you are watching on Facebook, whether my Facebook or RT's multiple Facebook portals, please share right now with all of your friends so that Mr. Algorithm can no longer suppress us. Tell all your friends now that I'm broadcasting live on RT, on the mother of all talk shows. I'd thank you if you were to do so. And if you're watching on YouTube, either again my own YouTube page or RT's multiple YouTube pages, please subscribe while you're there. You can watch on Twitter, on your telephone. You can watch on Instagram. My good wife is here. That's why we're on Instagram. You can watch on Twitch. You can watch on a multitude of different platforms. But however you watch or listen, the one thing you'll get here is the truth. At least the truth as I see it. I might be wrong, but you can be sure that I believe that I am right, that nobody paid me to have the views I have, that no one can buy me or rent me, that no one can frighten me out of the views that I have. Let me say right up at the top, I'm dedicating this show to the late and great Brian Travers, one of the dearest of my friends that I ever had or ever will have. Brian Travers, the saxophone player, songwriter, musician, painter, and human being of the very highest order. That's Brian there. It's one of my proudest possessions, that picture, because the relationship that I had with Brian Travers was such that I broke down and cried when I learned that he had passed away after a brave fight with cancer. And I mean brave. You'd have had to know how he fought that cancer to know what bravery is. Brian Travers was part of UB40 from the beginning, a founder member of the band, the writer of some of their best tunes, the saxophonist on all of their best tunes, and a man who knew the music business inside out, who could have sat on his laurels as a great sax player. But he was always reaching, stretching into different areas. He developed himself as a quite outstanding painter, and I'm very glad to say that I am in possession of some of his work that I can enjoy and treasure for always. The band split up, but they have come together in their mutual grief and respect at the passing of Brian Travers. He was also a founder member of the party that I lead, the Workers' Party of Britain, joined on day one. He was a socialist. He was a working class man. He was a working class hero. And as John Lennon told us, a working class hero is something to be. May God rest your sweet soul, Brian Travers. Like me also, Brian is of Irish extraction and therefore was very familiar with the British state's crimes in Ireland, one of which we'll be talking about in the show this evening. In the 1980s, I was closely associated with the magazine Private Eye. I used to write for them. I used to come and go in their office in Soho in London, I used to attend the famous private eye lunches in the Coach and Horses in Soho. And one man's name was very often on the lips of the people who made private eye great during that period. And that name was Colin Wallace. Colin Wallace was a British state intelligence asset who was used here in Britain and in Ireland for some of the most nefarious, dirty tricks in a long, dirty war conducted by our own intelligence services against not only the people of Ireland, but also against the Labour Party and its leaders, Harold Wilson and Ted Short, in government in the 1970s here in Britain. Just like Dr. David Kelly, about whom more later, Colin Wallace started to go rogue. He started to question the role of Britain in Ireland and the role that he, in particular, was being asked to play against democracy in Britain, which he'd always thought was what he was fighting for in Ireland on behalf of British state security. And lo and behold, he got set up and charged with murder. I suppose he was lucky in the way that Dr. David Kelly was not. A fascinating new film about Colin Wallace and his life and times has been produced, and we are lucky enough to be interviewing the man who made the film later in this show. But I expect the show this week will, as last week, be dominated by the extraordinary events in Afghanistan. An horrific, obscene terrorist atrocity was carried out at Kabul Airport, as, with unerring accuracy, the American government promised us it would be. They even identified the name of the organization, hitherto unknown to most people, that would carry it out. They even knew that it was going to be an explosion, and explosion it was. The organization that carried out the attack on Kabul Airport was something called ISIS Khorasan. Khorasan has been used before as a reason for a massive increase in the offensive military power used in Syria by the coalition of the killing there. Khorasan is a real place. Khorasan is Afghanistan and Pakistan and part of former Soviet Central Asia. And it is perfectly possible that there is such an organization as ISIS Khorasan. Although how that would be differentiated from ISIS, which of course we've been doing our best to help in Syria over this last decade, would be more difficult in the time available to me to adumbrate. But in any event, amongst the thousands, tens of thousands of Afghan civilians massing at the airport, as the United States government asked them to do, come to the airport, they told everyone who thought they had a right to be flown out by these scuttling occupation forces, and they duly did. And they were standing knee-deep in sewage, waving their papers pathetically, trying to attract the attention of those with the power to let them on board an aeroplane and out of harm's way, they thought. But they were not out of harm's way. Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe, we called him, that's actually before he actually fell asleep whilst listening to, there he is there, literally asleep while the Prime Minister of Israel is talking to him in the United States. I was glad when he woke up. I thought perhaps he'd passed away, died of boredom, listening to Naftali Bennett, the new Prime Minister of Israel. But Joe Biden, on the night of the horrific attack, which killed perhaps 200 people, 200 people, and maimed and injured hundreds and hundreds more, told the American people 8 hours after the event, 8 hours after the event, that America had faced a series of complex attacks, only for the Pentagon spokesman to confess the next day that it was not complex, it could not have been more primitive, that it was not attacks, it was one attack. The 2 explosions was only one explosion. The attackers were only one terrorist, fanatic suicide bomber with explosives strapped to his chest had somehow managed to kill such a vast number of people. Call me old, but I smelt a rat at the number of people dead from one suicide bomber. And I was right to smell that rat, because it turns out that most of the people killed at Kabul Airport were not killed by the ISIS suicide bomber, but were killed by reckless automatic fire from the United States Marine Corps. It reminded me of my grandfather's famous story, so famous he told it every time he had a drink, that when he was at Monte Cassino in World War II in Italy, when the Germans flew over, all the British ducked. And when the British flew over, all the Germans ducked. And when the Americans flew over, everybody, Germans and British, ducked. This kind of reckless display of lethal violence killed most of the 200, most of them. Imagine it. They were there with their papers trying to reach America, and they were shot down by American armed forces. Tells you much, I think, about the reckless disregard, or perhaps the contempt, which the occupation had come to feel for the people of Afghanistan. Somehow summed up, although I know it's complicated, by the extraordinary decision to put a lot of pet animals on an airplane with no people on board, when thousands of people were still waiting to be airlifted to safety away from the Taliban. A lot of Taliban fighters were killed in the airport incident also, though whether they were blown up or shot by the Marines remains a mystery. But Joe Biden's 8-hour delay, his utterly misleading, if not deliberately false report, haltingly delivered, seemingly by a man with 1 foot at least in the grave, 1 foot at least in the grave, was nothing as to what he did next. He's just droned an entire family in Kabul. A man, a wife, children, grandchildren have all just been slaughtered today by a drone attack launched by Joe Biden. He says it was an attack on ISIS Khorasan masterminds, balderdash. It was the mass murder of yet another Afghan family, untold thousands of whom have already been wiped out by such insane, indiscriminate use of lethal firepower. The muscles, but not the brains. That's the United States Armed Forces. And that's why they, and therefore we here in Britain and other allies of the United States, are in the place we now are, utterly humiliated by an American president that knew for 18 months that his predecessor had signed a deal to leave, but did nothing to prepare the thousands, tens of thousands of British and American people to get them out of the country before the Taliban took power. It beggars belief. It is beyond belief that you would scuttle out of a country in the middle of the night, leaving billions of dollars of high-powered weaponry, even Black Hawk helicopters. You didn't even blow them up. They left them there. And they're now in the hands of the Taliban if we're lucky, of ISIS if we're unlucky. Just ponder that. In the middle of the night, without even telling the Afghan army serving on the same base that you were leaving and you wouldn't be coming back. Whilst knowing that tens of thousands of your own nationals were now unprotected from a Taliban onslaught and ultimate victory. There's still 1,500 British citizens in Afghanistan who have not been able to be airlifted, although those pets were. And the reason for that is because Joe Biden left us all up the creek without a paddle. I don't know how the citizens of the United States can bear to be led by such an imbecile who can't even stay awake whilst talking to another prime minister in full view of the television and still cameras. I've gone on too long. There's so much I want to say. I said much of it last week, and I've tried again this week. If you're not careful, if we're not all careful and lucky, I'll have to be talking about it for many, many weeks to come. But you've come to the right place to have a proper up and down, bare knuckle Barney about this. If you disagree with me, we want to hear from you.